The galaxy holds scars too vast to chart, but none bleed quite like a warp-touched sector. Here, the laws of reality flicker like a failing lumen lamp, and the boundaries between flesh, faith, and madness bend into unrecognizable shapes. Whole regiments vanish in silence, their banners found days later woven into structures no hand could have built. Ships emerge from the void with their crews smiling, though their bones have turned to glass. It is not a place forgotten by the Imperium, it is a place remembered too clearly, yet too faintly to escape. To speak of it is to invite the echo of its presence. To enter it is to risk never returning as yourself. If the Imperium thrives on memory and the Emperor's light, this sector feeds on forgetting and shadow. And yet, soldiers are sent, priests chant, skittery march. Someone must hold the line, even if the line is only a prayer whispered into a storm that does not care. If you are drawn into stories that peel back the iron curtain of the 41st millennium and reveal what lies beneath the half-seen horrors, the unrecorded campaigns, the desperate survival where victory is not measured in banners but in heartbeats, then you belong with us here. Like, share, and subscribe, not for vanity, but to strengthen the voice that carries these tales through the void. Every echo counts, every signal matters. The regiment had marched for 3 days without a mouthful of true sustenance. The supply columns that were meant to follow had never emerged from the warp-touched passage, and no signal carried back from the void gave clarity to their fate. What reached the men instead was hunger, not as they had known it before, but sharpened into something unnatural, something that gnawed not only at their guts, but at the very fabric of their perception. Hard biscuit and nutrient paste had long since been exhausted, but still they chewed, jaws working on emptiness, swallowing air as though it had weight. They convinced themselves of flavor that was not there, of texture where none existed. They marched not on food, but on memory, on the idea that once, somewhere, a meal had been real. The first sign of the sector's touch came when the water turned. The filters produced liquid that shimmered with a metallic sheen, tasting of blood and promethium both. The men drank, for thirst held a blade against their throats, but each swallow came with the illusion of ash coating the tongue. Some spat it out, claiming it was poison. Others drained entire canisters, as if it were wine, laughing while black residue stained their teeth. Soon the distinction blurred between sustenance and hallucination, between survival and surrender. The officers tried to keep count of rations, though none remained. They distributed nothing, but still, the soldiers queued. Discipline demanded ritual, and so each day they lined up, hands outstretched for food that never appeared, saluting officers who gave invisible portions with solemn faces. The ritual steadied them more than any caloric intake could have. Hunger was no longer a wound, it became liturgy. To eat nothing was to endure. To receive nothing was to remain imperial. Yet the absence began to shape them. Bellies shrank, eyes grew glassy, but their steps synchronized, as if some unseen rhythm carried them forward. Hunger should have fractured them into frenzy, driven them to madness and cannibalism, but it did not. Instead, deprivation wove them together tighter than chains. No man broke ranks, no soldier abandoned his post. When one stumbled, another caught him. When one collapsed, he was lifted, not left behind. The absence of food did what no commissar's pistol had ever achieved. It forged unity absolute. It was then that visions began. Men swore they saw meals spread across the ground, banquets laid between shattered Some knelt, hands trembling as they reached for roasted groks or thick loaves of bread, only for their fingers to close on rubble. Others tasted broth on their tongues as they breathed in the stink of decay. The captain, his name still spoken with respect, though his face had withered to parchment, told them such visions were gifts. The sector tested them, and the Emperor supplied illusions to remind them that hunger was a crucible, not a curse. His voice carried calm authority. even as his cheeks hollowed deeper each passing hour. Night brought stranger torments. Soldiers woke with mouths full of grit, claiming they had eaten in their sleep. Some awoke screaming, convinced their comrades had gnawed at them in the dark, though no wounds marked their skin. The psyker attached to the regiment whispered that he tasted meals through the warp, that their hunger had bled into Imperium currents and returned as echoes. When pressed, he admitted he feared it was not the Emperor sending comfort but something else, something hungry in return. Yet still they marched. The sector did not devour them with sudden claws or demonic flame, it bled them slowly, like a leech content with patience. What little strength remained in their muscles did not break. They grew gaunt, skeletal figures wrapped in flak armor, too large for them now. But their eyes, sunken though they were, held an intensity unshaken. Hunger had hollowed them out, but in the hollowness something new lived, a discipline beyond reason, a binding absence that replaced bread and meat. One day, a forward squad reported finding an abandoned crate half buried in slag. They halted back, breathless with anticipation. The officers gathered the men, lifted the lid, and revealed within only scraps of wrapping, empty tins crushed flat, and a single spoon clotted with something long since dried. The men cheered. They held the spoon aloft as though it were a relic, as though it proved that food had once been real. They passed it from hand to hand, each kissing the rusted metal. Hunger had taught them to worship absence itself, and they treated the shadow of nourishment as holy. By the second week, voices grew faint, bodies bent under invisible weight. But not one man deserted, not one mutiny stirred. Commissars had no need to raise their pistols. Hunger was both lash and bond. The regiment, though starved, became unbreakable, welded into something more terrifying than the well-fed, men who no longer needed sustenance to march, who had transcended the flesh in their devotion to emptiness. It is said that when relief finally arrived, another column stumbling from the warp's edge, they found the regiment standing in formation, gaunt shadows with lasguns at the ready. They had not eaten in 21 days. Their supply wagons rolled in, crates bursting with ration packs, steaming pots of recap. The soldiers of the starved regiment did not move. They did not approach. They stared at the food as if it were a trick, a hallucination come to tempt them from the unity they had forged in hunger. The captain gave no order to eat. He only told them to march on. The city had been dead long before they entered it. No fires burned in the manufactoria, no light glowed in the hab blocks, no voices carried across the plazas where once thousands must have walked. The silence was so complete it seemed sculpted, as if absence itself had been quarried into the foundations. Buildings leaned like broken teeth, their stonework fractured, but none had collapsed. It was as though ruin had been arrested, mid-collapse, frozen in the act of crumbling. The regiment entered with weapons raised, boots crunching glass, and for a moment it felt like another abandoned city among the billions scattered across Imperial space. That illusion held only until night fell. The first sign was breath. Thin, cold drafts seeped through the stone, not from broken windows or shattered walls, but from the stone itself. The air exhaled from cracks that had not been there by day. Soldiers leaned against walls and swore they felt faint vibrations, like lungs expanding deep within rock. When questioned, no one admitted to sleeping near masonry again. Yet the city offered no other shelter, and so every barracks, every command post, every makeshift shrine was hemmed in by walls that breathed like beasts. Then came the echoes. At first they were faint, dismissed as tricks of acoustics in hollow chambers, but soon they sharpened. A man whispered a prayer to the Emperor before sleep, and the words returned hours later from the far end of the corridor, spoken in his exact voice. Another cursed the city's emptiness, and the insult slithered back at dawn, whispered from the ceiling above his cot. Even the smallest murmurs, the name of a mother, a soldier's confession of fear, were caught and replayed. Stone did not merely hold sound, it remembered. Paranoia spread faster than any contagion. Men covered their mouths when they spoke, others swore oaths in silence, communicating with gestures rather than risk their words becoming ammunition for unseen listeners. But silence bred its own torment. In quiet, the walls grew louder. A kind of pressure built, as if the city demanded offerings of sound. The moments when no one spoke became unbearable, the air thick, vibrating, until someone broke and muttered just to relieve the weight. Inevitably, their words returned hours later, twisted, cruel, stripped of meaning, and reassembled like mockery. The psyker assigned to the regiment warned the officers that the stone had been touched, that the sector itself warped not only flesh, but material, embedding fragments of thought into masonry like fossils into rock. He refused to sleep indoors, bedding down beneath broken statues rather than risk being surrounded by listening stone. Yet even there, he claimed the ground itself pressed against his mind, soaking in fragments of his dreams. His ramblings grew more frantic by the day, until finally he sealed his lips with wire, blood dripping as he locked his mouth shut. Desperate to keep his thoughts from bleeding into the city, he lasted 3 more days before his silence killed him. But the walls did not remain content with listening. They began to speak unbidden. Entire halls thrummed with voices, choruses of every prayer ever whispered within them. Staircases echoed with sobs that no soldier admitted to making. Officers found their own commands, repeated back in distorted tones, giving false orders at night that sent men stumbling into alleys and collapsing in exhaustion. Even the commissar was not spared. His threats, once sharp and decisive, returned days later from doorframes and pillars in sing-song voices that turned discipline into parody. He shot 3 men on suspicion of mimicry before realizing the stone had been mocking him. Soon no one trusted what they heard. A cry for help in the dark might be a comrade in peril or simply the wall repeating a plea from days past. Squads broke apart, men refusing to follow voices, no matter how desperate. The city divided them, isolating each within an echo chamber of their own sins and secrets. Arguments erupted, not over strategy or survival, but over whether a sound was real. In such confusion, cohesion began to crumble faster than bodies could. It was on the 7th night that the walls began to breathe louder than men. The regiment reported, hearing the collective murmur of their own voices, spoken back at them in unison, a tapestry of every word, every whisper, every curse and prayer, woven into one monstrous chorus. The sound built until it rattled teeth, shook glass, collapsed weak masonry. Men fired lasguns into the walls, explosions of dust billowing, but still, the voices carried, unaffected. Bolter fire echoed for hours afterward, replayed again and again, so that the city never ceased roaring with phantom war. Some claimed the city had become a recorder for the warp itself, that it stored not merely words, but fragments of souls. Each utterance a deposit, each sigh a tithe, until eventually the stone itself outweighed the men who walked within it. Others claimed it was punishment, that the emperor himself had marked this place, so that the sins of every soldier would be remembered and replayed until repentance was impossible. Whatever truth lay beneath, no order could silence the sound once it began. By dawn, the regiment no longer dared enter buildings. They marched instead through streets open to the ash-ridden sky, setting up camp in plazas rather than within haps. Walls were avoided like contagion. Yet, even in the open, echoes carried. Stone facades groaned with remembered hymns, statues whispered insults, fountains hissed, prayers half forgotten. It became clear that the city did not need proximity to listen. It had always been listening, in the end. They left the city not because of enemy pressure, nor lack of supplies, but because speech itself had become unbearable. Every word was betrayal. Every silence was torment. The last vox logs sent before their departure captured only one thing: the regiment's own voices, layered atop one another until the words were indistinguishable. The log ends with breath long, drawn out, like the sigh of a living stone. The captain had once been known for his steady hand. His men trusted him because he listened, because he weighed every order against their survival, because he carried the discipline of the Astra Militarum with a human face that never faltered. But in the warp-touched sector, something shifted. It began quietly. His officers noticed first. Nights passed in which he never retired. He remained at the table, staring at maps, long after candles guttered out, eyes reflecting nothing but the dull glow of data slates. At first, they assumed it was duty. Yet dawn after dawn, they found him still seated, back rigid, gaze fixed. His eyes did not close, not even in exhaustion's reflex. Sleep had abandoned him. Days stretched into weeks. His face grew hollow, but no tremor marked his hands. He strode among the lines without stumble, voice sharp as ever. The men whispered that the Emperor had blessed him, that vigilance eternal had been placed upon him as a gift. To march behind a leader who never slept meant no ambush could surprise them, no treachery could bloom unseen. Commissars encouraged the tale, for it hardened morale. And so the regiment began to believe that their sleepless captain was proof that the Imperium itself watched through him. But beneath the reverence, something darker unfolded. His gaze lingered too long. He would stand in silence, eyes fixed on a soldier until sweat dripped from the man's brow. He paced alone at night, lips moving with no sound. Once, an officer swore he heard him speaking not to men but to shadows, answering questions that no one had asked aloud. The captain denied nothing. He claimed clarity sharpened without dreams, that visions clouded judgment, that he saw more in silence than others did in rest. His voice carried conviction strong enough to quiet doubts. Yet even as his men believed, fractures grew, maps began to change under his hand. Routes redrawn without explanation, symbols marked in places no scout had reported. When pressed, he said the terrain spoke to him, that he felt the pull of unseen paths beneath his boots. The regiment followed, though the paths led through swamps where no road had existed, across hills whose stones cut boots to ribbons. Still, they marched, because their captain's stare did not waver. To question him was to question the Emperor's vigilance, and yet there were slips. He forgot names he had spoken daily for years, calling veterans by the wrong rank, the wrong title. Once, he saluted a man, already dead, staring into empty space, as though the soldier still stood before him. The men exchanged glances, but none corrected him. His authority had grown too absolute to fracture with doubt. The sleeplessness had made him more than human to them, and so his mistakes were folded into the myth. It was not wrong he was touched, but what touched him? That question wormed into hushed conversations at the edge of campfires. Some claimed it was the Emperor's light piercing through the fog of dreams, cleansing his mind of mortal weakness. Others whispered that the warp had seeped into him, hollowing sleep out of his skull, filling the void with whispers that guided his steps. The more he refused rest, the stronger the rumor grew. It was not hunger that bound them now, nor fear of walls that listened. It was the sleepless eyes of a captain who no longer blinked. Then came the night he ordered the regiment to march without pause. No halts, no camps, no time for rest. He strode at the front, last pistol drawn, eyes fixed on a horizon no one else could see. His men followed, staggering, some collapsing, yet rising again under the weight of his gaze. Days blurred into one endless march. The soldiers slept on their feet, stumbling through visions, yet he remained upright, his stare like a lantern dragging them onward. It was then that the question began to turn. Were they following him, or was he following them? Did his sleepless mind guide their path, or did the regiment's blind faith drive him deeper into madness? By the 12th day, he began to speak less. His orders became gestures, fragmented phrases, often unfinished, yet his men understood him, or thought they did. They acted not on clarity, but on instinct, interpreting silence as command, half-words as orders. In this way, his authority dissolved, not into chaos, but into a strange unity, where command and obedience blurred into the same thing. Captain and regiment were one, sleeplessness binding them into a rhythm beyond strategy or reason. Witnesses claimed his eyes grew glassy, reflecting not the world before him, but something deeper, as though he stared always into a horizon no one else could glimpse. In one report, he stood atop a ridge and declared he saw the gates of Terra itself opening before them. His men knelt, though all they saw was wasteland. They wept, believing his sleeplessness granted him vision of salvation. Others whispered that the gates he saw did not belong to Terra, but to something far darker. When at last he fell, it was not in battle, nor in silence. He collapsed mid-step, body folding to the ground, yet his eyes remained open. They never closed, even in death. The regiment refused to bury him. They propped his body against a stone, last pistol still clutched in hand, and marched on. They said the Emperor had not taken his soul, only his sleep. His gaze would remain with them, carried in their minds, sleepless still. From that day, the regiment moved without captains or commissars. They guided themselves, yet claimed every step was ordered by the man whose eyes had never shut. Whether they followed a memory, a vision, or a fracture in reality no one could say, but they marched as though the sleepless gaze remained fixed upon them, unblinking, eternal. The manufactorum stood like a titan slouched in prayer, its towers cracked, its smokestacks bleeding only thin wisps that dissolved into the ash-heavy sky. The regiment approached it with caution, expecting silence and ruin, yet the air thrummed with rhythm. Not the mechanical cadence of conveyor belts or hydraulic presses, but voices, low sonorous, metallic in resonance. The servitors still labored within, but their labor was no longer the kind catalogued in any data slate of the Adeptus Mechanicus. They sang dot, their voices emerged in chords, a harmony formed not of design but of glitch. Vox grills warbled tones that rose and fell in patterns almost liturgical. Their augmetic mouths opened and closed in unison, syllables distorted but unmistakable, hymns. Fragments of ecclesiarchy canticles twisted with binary litany, fused into a drone that filled the cavernous halls. The sound pressed against the soldiers' ears, resonating in their teeth and bones. Even the most faithless among them paused, shivering, uncertain if they had entered a machine temple or a tomb. Yet the machines did not stand idle. Looms spun threads that no one had ordered. Forges spat sparks across assembly lines where no blueprints guided their labor. Gears turned, pistons hammered, and objects emerged, strange relics without pattern or purpose. A knife that curved into a spiral rather than a blade. A chalice sealed at the brim, incapable of holding liquid. Cog-toothed, symbols half-formed, some resembling the imperial aquila, others bearing shapes unrecorded in any catechism. Each object clattered down the line, and each was lifted reverently by a waiting servitor, held aloft as though consecrated, before being placed on heaps that resembled shrines more than storage bays. The soldiers watched in silence. Some whispered it was a miracle, the Emperor's hand guiding the flesh machine chorus to new forms of worship. Others spat, claiming it was corruption, the warp seeping into steel, mutating production into mockery. The tech priest assigned to the regiment trembled as he approached the line, mechadendrites twitching. His incantations faltered when he tried to seize control. Commands sent through new spheric channels were absorbed and sung back at him, distorted into hymns that drowned his authority. For the first time, his machine voice broke. He fell to his knees, weeping static, and muttered that the Omnissiah was speaking in tongues too vast for him to understand. The men grew uneasy, yet desperate hearts reached for meaning. Hunger and sleeplessness had taught them to endure absence and silence. Now, in the manufactorum, they were confronted with abundance and sound. Relics piled higher, strange icons glittering under forge light. Soldiers began to pocket them. A spiral knife became a talisman against ambush. A sealed chalice was kissed before battle. Even the half-formed Aquila fragments were fastened to armor, treated as proof that the Emperor had not abandoned them. What had begun as unease turned to reverence, and reverence soon to obsession. Nights were no longer quiet. Men gathered around the shrines of malformed relics, chanting with the They learned the patterns, syllables, alien but familiar, voices growing hoarse as they repeated until collapse. The commissar tried to halt it, branding the practice heresy. He drew his pistol, declared death to any who worshipped malfunction. But when he fired at a relican orb, etched with shifting grooves, the manufactorum answered. Every servitor raised its head in unison, hymns cutting into a single note so piercing it split glass and shattered his sidearm. The commissar fell, bleeding from his ears, his words forever silenced. None spoke of rebellion after that. The tech priest disappeared. Some swore they saw him walking into the assembly line, mechadendrites outstretched like arms reaching for communion. The machines embraced him, gears folding around his body, presses descending in rhythm, and when the hymn reached crescendo, his scream became another verse. When the line resumed, an object lay upon the conveyor, a mask of bronze, shaped like his face, eyes hollow, mouth frozen mid. It was placed atop a shrine without comment. The regiment bowed before it. Faith and malfunction blurred until no one could distinguish one from the other. Were the servitors broken, or were they closer to divinity than any flesh could comprehend? Were the relics trash, or were they scripture cast in metal and oil? Each soldier decided for himself, yet each decision drew him deeper. Some refused to leave the manufactorum at all, remaining in its glow, chanting until their throats tore. Others carried relics on chains about their necks, whispering to them like saints. The captain, his eyes sleepless, still declared the manufactorum a holy site, a gift left in the warp-touched sector to prove the emperor's will persisted even in corruption. His voice carried weight enough to make doubt impossible. And so the regiment moved on, leaving the towers behind. But their packs rattled with strange relics, their voices hoarse from song. The manufactorum continued, unbothered by their departure, servitors chanting into the endless ash dark, machines forging icons for no hand but their own. It is said that long after, when others entered the city, they found the manufactorum still alive. Relics piled higher, shrines grown vast, hymns so loud the stone quivered. Some reported the objects were no longer formless. They resembled weapons of war, yet each twisted wrong lacerfulls without triggers, grenades filled not with powder but ash. None could tell if they were useless or too holy to comprehend, and still the servitors sang, as if the machines had ceased serving men and begun serving something greater. No, one agreed on whether it was miracle or corruption, perhaps both, perhaps neither, but the memory of the manufactorum lingered in every soldier who walked away from it. For each carried proof, in their packs proof, that machines could sing, that relics could birth themselves, and that faith did not need to be true to be real. The orders that brought the regiment to orbit were clear, yet when they read them aloud, the words twisted. The name of the planet blurred on the data slate, glyphs smearing across the screen until only a black rectangle remained. Officers tried to transcribe it by hand, but their script faltered mid-letter, as if their muscles forgot the shape. Even the most disciplined pen could not hold its form. Within hours, every copy of the orders carried only absence where a designation should have been, from above. The planet seemed ordinary, oceans veiled in gray storms, continents marked by jagged mountain ridges, valleys of ash, scattered industrial ruins. But when the Vox officers attempted to log coordinates, the machine spirits rebelled. Numbers flickered and rearranged. Files erased themselves. Entire data stacks in the ship's cogitators became blank, not corrupted, not destroyed, simply erased, as if they had never been filled. A planet without a name was still a planet, yet it refused recognition. It rejected remembrance. They descended regardless. Boots struck soil, and the sensation was like walking on sandpaper rough, grating, leaving skin raw even through flax soles. The air was breathable, though every breath tasted like parchment scorched at the edges. Settlements dotted the landscape, half ruined, but inhabited. People emerged from doorways, gaunt figures wrapped in cloaks, stitched from unfamiliar fibers, eyes vacant but not hostile. When asked what they called their home, they gave 100 different answers. Some said it was a saint's world. Others named a number. Others gave words that belonged to no tongue known to the Imperium. Yet when the soldiers tried to repeat these names, they slipped from memory before reaching the ear. The syllables curdled on their tongues, vanishing like vapor. The regiment established camp, setting banners into the soil. But by dawn, the aquila stitched onto cloth hung blank, embroidery frayed to featureless gray. Vox recordings of the previous day's reports played back as silence. The captain barked orders to inscribe names upon armor, to carve titles into walls, to etch coordinates into stone if data could not hold. But chisels dulled, blades snapped, and stone revealed no mark. Whatever force pervaded this world did not simply erase it, prevented memory from taking root. Panic spread in whispers. What was a world without a name? To fight for such a place felt like clutching smoke. Yet, desertion was impossible, for leaving required bearing record of where one had been. And already the star charts aboard the fleet had gone blank. Without designation, the void itself did not know how to return. The soldiers realized with cold clarity, they could not leave what could not be. Remembered, the inhabitants endured without question. They lived in their settlements, trading goods of no origin, eating crops no one could name. When pressed on history, they shrugged. No one recalled ancestors, or construction of cities, or wars fought on their soil. They only knew they were here, and that they always had been. One elder laughed when asked about his childhood, insisting he had been born countless times, each the first, each the only. His mirth chilled more than silence. The regiment clung to discipline, yet it faltered. Reports written in the evening were blank in the morning, casualty logs emptied, as if no one had fallen, yet graves were dug, bodies buried. Men who wept for comrades found the tears drying too quickly, memory of the fallen fading before grief could complete its course. Even death was erased, leaving only hollow fatigue. A world without memory, consumed past and present alike. Some soldiers tried to carve their own flesh, to write names into skin where stone and slate failed. They screamed as letters burned away, even while knives cut, wounds sealing over with unmarked scars. Others whispered prayers to the emperor, but even litanies faltered. The familiar cadences of catechism crumbled mid-verse, leaving mouths moving without sound, faith stripped of language. Chaplains declared it a test, that true belief required no record, but their own voices quavered as homilies dissolved into stutters. The sleepless captain wandered among them, his gaze more hollow than ever. He told them this world was cursed to forget itself, and in that forgetting lay a truth greater than names. He insisted they were witnessing purity, a place stripped of identity where only survival endured. His eyes glittered with something feverish, and though the men shivered, they followed. To disobey meant losing even the record of disobedience. It is said that after 3 weeks, the regiment no longer remembered why they had come. Orders had vanished. Maps were blank. Banners were colorless cloth. All that remained was the act of marching, patrolling, eating, sleeping. Identity fell away, until they were no longer soldiers of the Astra Militarum, but shadows of men repeating actions without cause. Some insisted that was the point. To live without memory was to live without sin, without burden, without future. Others argued it was damnation beyond comprehension. The last Vox signal sent from orbit reported only static. followed by a single phrase repeated in 100 voices. "We are here. We are always here." The name of the planet was gone. The name of the regiment soon followed. They came without banners, without escort, without sanction. Pilgrims, ragged and countless, pouring across poisoned plains as though summoned by a voice none but they could hear. Their feet were bare, bleeding with every step upon the glassy soil, but they smiled through it. Each face turned toward the ash-thick horizon, as though toward a sun invisible to all others. The first of them were sighted at dawn, figures stumbling, coughing, eyes streaming red from the grit that scoured the air. By dusk, their number had grown to thousands, a tide of flesh and devotion moving with the inevitability of a river. The regiment barred their path. Lasguns raised, orders barked to halt, but the pilgrims did not falter. They moved as though the soldiers were mist, walking straight through the cordons, mouths whispering words the vox recorders could not capture. Those who touched them recoiled, skin hot, as though fevered, yet the flesh of the pilgrims did not blister. It burned and peeled, yes, in the storms, but they bore it without scream or flinch. Even when bones broke through skin, their lips stretched wider, murmuring praises. When the storms rose, black as night and heavy with cinders that flayed skin raw, the pilgrims lifted their arms. They claimed to see the Emperor's face in the shifting ash, eyes and mouth outlined in smoke, a countenance larger than the heavens. Soldiers cowered behind visors, coughing blood into filters. But the pilgrims opened their mouths wide, swallowing grit and soot until their throats clogged. Some choked bodies collapsing to the ground, but even in death, their lips curved upward in beatific smiles. Those who survived staggered on, coughing streams of red across the dust, leaving trails like unholy blessings. The chaplains argued endlessly. Was this proof of faith transcendent, or blasphemy so complete it mimicked devotion? Some claimed the Emperor's light could pierce even the warp's filth, drawing souls to himself across poisoned wastes. Others warned it was the sector itself, wearing his visage, mocking with illusions shaped to lure the weak. Yet as the debates raged, more pilgrims came, each from different corners of the Imperium, each bearing the same story, visions of light within ash, a voice calling them here, promising presence, promising nearness. The regiment found themselves caught between awe and revulsion. Some soldiers broke down, weeping as they watched mortals walk unarmed, unarmored, across land that devoured tanks and scarred ceramite. They believed, if these fragile figures could survive, even thrive, then surely the Emperor's hand was at work. Others turned their faces away, fists clenched, unwilling to watch as humanity mutilated itself in ecstasy. To them it was heresy embodied, a theater of madness. But the pilgrims did not argue. They did not demand protection, food, or shelter. They lived on nothing. Their ribs showed like prison bars beneath torn skin, but no complaint passed their lips. When night fell, they gathered in circles, singing hymns that carried across the plains. The sound was cracked and blood-choked, yet hauntingly beautiful, harmonies born of shared ruin. Soldiers listened from their camps, unable to sleep, their dreams haunted by echoes of those melodies. Death was constant among the pilgrims, yet it carried no weight. When one collapsed mid-march, coughing viscera, the others did not stop. They stepped around the body, leaving it to dissolve into dust. Some carried bones in pouches, kissing them as relics, though no distinction was made between saint and stranger. In their eyes, every pilgrim was holy. To fall was not failure, but ascension. The regiment, trained to weep not for the fallen but to honor them with record and right, found themselves shaken by this casual dismissal. To see death treated, not as burden, but as breathless joy, cracked discipline in ways no enemy had achieved. One night, during the height of a storm, a figure appeared at the head of the pilgrim mass. A woman, tall, gaunt, her face eroded by wind until only bone gleamed, yet her eye sockets burned with light. She raised her arms, and thousands fell silent. Her voice cut through the roar of the storm, not amplified, not mechanical, but carried on something deeper. She declared that the Emperor's face was not in Terra's golden halls, but here, in ash, in ruin, in suffering freely embraced. The pilgrims fell to their knees, weeping in gratitude. Soldiers trembled as they listened, for they could not tell whether her voice spoke in truth or in mockery. The commissar ordered her execution, raising his pistol before the crowd. But as the shot cracked, the storm itself surged. The bullet vanished into dust, never striking flesh. The pilgrims erupted in praise, lifting their arms higher, believing the Emperor had deflected the shot. The commissar himself stumbled, choking, his lips stained black with ash. He survived, but his voice never returned. The regiment could not halt the tide. The pilgrims passed through them, wave upon wave, walking toward a destination none could name. Some soldiers deserted their posts to join them, tearing off armor, stripping boots, marching barefoot with the rest. Others shut their visors tighter, swearing oaths never to let the madness touch them. Yet the sight lingered, faces upturned, bloodied mouths smiling, ash-choking lungs while eyes gleamed as though they looked upon salvation. It is said the pilgrims are still walking, that their number swells with each passing year, drawn from systems untouched, their visions carrying them to the same poisoned plains. Whether it is faith made manifest, or corruption wearing the Emperor's guise, none can say. But those who watched will never forget the sight of humanity bleeding joy into the dust, smiling as their flesh peeled, convinced they had touched eternity. It rose where stone had once stood. The maps called it a shrine city, a place where the ecclesiarchy had planted its banners centuries before. Its chapels meant to shine like lanterns against the darkness of the scepter. But when the regiment arrived, they found no stone, no steel, no relics hammered into permanence. What towered there instead was smoke that did not disperse, ash that did not fall. A cathedral formed from shifting haze, its arches coiling upward in spirals of soot, its spires tapering into clouds, yet never dissipating. Storms lashed the plains beyond, tearing soil and bone alike into fragments, but the cathedral endured untouched. Its walls shuddered and billowed, but they did not break. The air itself had been sculpted into sanctuary. The soldiers stared as the gates opened. They were not doors, but veils of drifting cinder that parted with a sigh. Inside, the cathedral glowed faintly, as if coals smoldered deep within smoke. Rows of pews emerged, woven from vapor dense enough to hold weight, though when touched, they flexed like fabric. The men stepped cautiously, boots leaving no trace, yet the floor held. The silence inside was immense, broken only by the faint crackle of unseen fires. And then the voices began. They came from the rafters first, rising like echoes of forgotten sermons. Words in high Gothic rolled across the nave, phrases carried in tones of authority, but no priest stood at the altar. The voices belonged to no body. Some were male, others female, some old, some young, all overlapping in layered sermons. They preached faith in endurance, in suffering, in silence. The soldiers stood transfixed, their hearts thrumming as though each voice spoke directly into their marrow. One trooper collapsed to his knees, hands raised in ecstasy. His mouth opened and he began to repeat the sermon in perfect cadence, though he had never studied scripture. Another wept, clawing at his eyes as though something behind them demanded release. The captain ordered withdrawal, but the command faded in his throat. He, too, heard the words, and they hollowed him. His sleepless eyes glistened as if seeing something at last. To worship there was to change. That truth revealed itself quickly. Men who knelt too long rose altered. One returned with skin so pale it seemed powdered with ash, eyes flickering like candle flames. Another staggered from the altar with limbs elongated, fingers trembling as though they reached for something unseen. Yet they smiled, serene, repeating the sermons in whispers. None resisted the transformation. They welcomed it as benediction. The chaplain among them faltered most of all. He had led prayers through hunger, through silence, through the nameless world, but here his voice cracked. He insisted the cathedral was not sanctity but trickery, a mask of the warp imitating holy shape. Yet, even as he warned, his own words slipped into chant, matching the disembodied sermons without his consent. He struck himself in the mouth to stop, blood flowing over his chin, but still the whispers issued from his throat. He fled into the storm and was never seen again. Outside, the cathedral's spires bent, twisting as though responding to unseen winds. The smoke curled into symbols Aquila, sigils of saints, relic shapes, half recognizable, but incomplete. Each shape melted into another, never fixed, never certain. The soldiers debated whether these were revelations or mockeries. No answer came, for the cathedral itself shifted with each passing hour. To watch it was to feel as though memory itself had turned fluid. Rumor spread swiftly. Pilgrims heard of the cathedral and converged upon it, thousands gathering, their chants blending with the phantom sermons. They walked barefoot into the nave, eyes wide, mouths open, ready to be filled. Some never left, dissolving into smoke with cries of joy, their forms absorbed into the walls. Others returned bearing relics of vapor, solidified into strange objects, a chalice that dripped nothing, a censer that smoked without coal. They swore these were gifts of the emperor's own hand. Soldiers argued otherwise, but still, they carried the relics home. It is said that when storms raged fiercest, the cathedral glowed brighter. Flashes of lightning revealed its spires stabbing into the heavens, columns of smoke carved like rib cages. In those moments, witnesses swore they saw faces within the walls. Thousands of them, mouthing sermons with devotion greater than any flesh could hold. Whether these were saints or victims, none could agree. The regiment lingered too long. When they finally withdrew, they found their numbers subtly diminished. No records told who had been lost. Only empty cots remained, and a faint trail of ash clinging to armor. Those who remained carried whispers with them, words that slipped unbidden into their speech. Their faith was changed, reshaped, though none could say into what. The cathedral still stands, if standing is the word. Smoke does not fade, ash does not fall. It endures, a shape without weight, a sermon without a speaker. Some call it a miracle, others an abomination, but all agree on this. To enter is to leave transformed, never in the same shape as before. They came like a green tide, as orcs always did, their ships crashing through the upper atmosphere in plumes of fire, their engines roaring louder than logic should allow. The regiment braced itself for the familiar cacophony bellows. War cries, the guttural laughter that rolled across battlefields like thunder. But when the first mobs surged from the wreckage, charging with cleavers and crude guns, there was only the stomp of boots and the crack of weapons. Not a single orc voice broke the air. The silence struck harder than the impact of their charge at first. The men believed it was trickery, some new tactic devised in brutish ignorance. They fired volleys into the green tide, watched orcs fall, and waited for the retaliatory roar. It never came. The orcs fought with savage strength, arms swinging, jaws gaping, but no sound issued forth. Even their guns spat only the mechanical bark of discharge, no triumphant laughter riding behind it. The battlefield filled with noise-loss fire, explosions, the shriek of steel on steel, but not the sound most feared. No laughter. Soldiers whispered that the sector itself had stripped the orcs of their voice. For generations, men had endured the orcs' howls, their guttural joy in violence. To hear none of it was worse. Each fight felt hollow, unreal, as though the clash of war lacked its soul. Men fired until their rifles overheated, not from discipline, but desperation, trying to fill the void where noise should have been. Still the orcs came, still silent, their eyes gleaming with a hunger they no longer voiced. The silence spread like contagion. Soldiers found their own battle cries faltering, throats closing when they tried to roar in defiance. Commissars shouted orders, but the words thinned in the air, barely carrying across the lines. It was as though the void had swallowed sound itself, feeding on noise as greedily as on flesh. Even the ringing of grenades seemed muted, explosions unfolding with less force than their fire should bear. Some swore the orcs themselves looked weaker. Their shoulders slouched, their movements sluggish, as though deprived of something more vital than blood. Orcs were born to noise, their laughter more weapon than blade, their booming joy the lifeblood of their wars. Without it, their fights lacked momentum. Battles dragged on longer, each clash a grinding stalemate rather than a surge of fury. Orcs still killed, still bled, but their silence robbed them of essence. The men began to pity them. To see orcs charge without laughter was to see beasts stripped of spirit. One soldier, cornered by a towering brute, froze not from fear, but from sorrow. He swore he saw the orc's throat strain, its jaw quiver, its chest heave as if trying to laugh. Nothing emerged. The blade swung down, silent, severing flesh without the roar that should have crowned the kill. The soldier lived long enough to report that he had not feared the silence, he had mourned it. But silence does not remain still. It seeped into the ranks, spreading among the humans as surely as among the orcs. After days of fighting, soldiers found themselves unable to laugh at small mercies, unable to cheer when rations were found or victories won. Even whispered jokes died in their throats. Chaplains raised hymns, but the words withered into breath. The battlefield became a theater without sound, movements and gestures carried out in dreadful quiet. It was then that the sleepless captain declared the truth. He stood among his men, eyes wide, and proclaimed that the emperor had silenced the orcs to prove their emptiness, that their laughter had always been hollow, a mockery of true faith. Now it was stripped, revealing only the void beneath. His men nodded, comforted by his certainty, but some could not shake the feeling that the silence was not judgment, it was theft. Something had stolen the roar from an entire species, and that something lingered still. The orcs did not retreat. They fought on, day after day, their silence unbroken, until finally their bodies lay strewn across the plains. No war boss rose to rally them. No voice shouted defiance. They died as they fought, soundless. The field stank of blood and oil, but no echo lingered. Only the hiss of ash carried on the wind. Long after the battle, the silence endured. Soldiers reported feeling it in their bones, a heaviness that pressed against lungs when they tried to speak. Some never spoke again, their voices lost, though their throats were whole. They became as quiet as the orcs they slew, shadows of men who moved with purpose but no sound. Others forced themselves to scream, tearing vocal cords raw, desperate to prove they still could. The mystery of what had stripped the orcs of their laughter was never solved. Some claimed the warp had consumed their joy, turning sound into sustenance. Others whispered that the orcs had glimpsed something in this sector that robbed them of mirth. Whatever the truth, one fact remained. When war ceases to echo, when laughter is stolen from the loudest species the galaxy has ever known, silence becomes more terrible than any roar. The first report came from a scouting party, their vox half choked with static, as they described a figure walking alone through the ruins of a manufactorum long since collapsed. They swore, the air shimmered around it, every step leaving a trail of dust that glowed faintly, like motes of starlight scattered upon the ground. At first their words were dismissed as delirium, heat, hunger, the warp's tricks upon tired minds. But when the regiment marched into the ruins days later, they too saw it, a silhouette drifting among the rubble, faceless in the haze, yet unmistakably human in form. Each footfall drew ash into patterns that glowed before dissolving back into nothingness. The soldiers froze. Some fell to their knees without command, heads bowed, las guns clattering to the ground. They whispered prayers, their voices cracked, but desperate, calling the figure a saint sent to guide them. Others gripped their weapons tighter, sweat pouring as they muttered that this was no miracle, only a phantom conjured by the warp to lure them into ruin. Both faith and fear held them immobile as the figure passed, silent, unhurried, leaving luminous dust in its wake. Rumors spread like fire. Men began to swear they had seen the figure before, walking at the edges of storms, watching battles from ridgelines, never near, never far. Some claimed it appeared in their dreams, offering a hand of dust that crumbled when touched. Chaplains seized upon it, declaring a living saint had descended, a sign that the Emperor still guided them even here. Sermons rose louder than they had in months, men kneeling in reverence before an absence given shape. Hope sparked, burning fierce and fast. Yet others recoiled. Officers muttered that the figure had no face, that its body did not cast shadow, that no vox could record its presence. One daring soldier approached it, kneeling as he reached for the glowing trail. The dust clung to his fingers, warm, almost tender. He lifted it to his lips in trembling faith. Moments later, he convulsed, his body collapsing into ash, his armor falling empty to the ground. His comrades wept, swearing his sacrifice proved sanctity. Others screamed that it was proof of corruption, that the saint was no blessing but executioner. The fracture widened. Some men began to collect the dust, cupping it in their palms, storing it in canisters, sprinkling it across wounds as though it bore healing power. And in truth, some wounds closed. A torn shoulder knit itself after being dusted. A burn faded to pale scar overnight. But for every healing came a death. Men swallowed the dust in devotion and crumbled into glowing ruin within hours. The randomness of it split faith further. Was the dust blessing or curse? Salvation or poison? No one could agree, and the regiment tore itself apart in whispered debate. The sleepless captain watched in silence. His gaze followed the figure wherever it appeared, his eyes unblinking as though he had known it all along. When asked, he gave no order, no confirmation, only the same words each time. Follow. His voice carried conviction enough that many obeyed. They trailed the figure through ruins and plains, marching not for supply, not for war, but for the dust's trail. Those who doubted followed too, unwilling to abandon comrades to madness. One night, under a sky cracked with lightning, the figure stopped at the heart of a shattered cathedral. It raised its arms, dust spilling in streams from its hands, glowing brighter than stars. The soldiers knelt as one, weeping, convinced they beheld divinity incarnate. Others screamed in denial, firing shots into the figure. Bolts of energy tore through its body, scattering it into fragments. But even as it broke apart, the dust glowed brighter, spiraling upward into the storm. When the storm cleared, the cathedral floor was blank. No figure remained. Only trails of ash lay in patterns that resembled wings. The regiment divided utterly after that. Half declared the saint had ascended, proof that their faith had been true. They built shrines from rubble, kneeling in circles around piles of collected dust, treating every glowing mote as relic. The others swore they had destroyed a warp phantasm, a parasite feeding on their faith. They demanded the shrines be torn down, the dust scattered. Blades and lasguns turned inward. Brothers bled brothers, not in pitched battle, but in skirmishes. Whispers turned to violence, faith burning hotter than unity. Even after order was restored, if order can ever truly be said to return, the memory lingered. Soldiers carried vials of dust around their necks, swearing it pulsed in time with their hearts. Others refused to step near the glowing motes, spitting in disgust at comrades who kissed them like charms. Hope and horror fused, until no one could tell one from the other. It is said that long after the regiment moved on, wanderers in the sector still saw the figure, always distant, always walking, always leaving dust that shimmered like starlight before fading into nothing. Some knelt in prayer, others turned and fled. No one ever touched it without consequence, but whether saint or shadow, blessing or executioner, the figure left one truth etched in ash: hope itself can burn as fiercely as fire, and faith can kill as easily as it saves. At the center of the warp-touched sector, there was no light, no flame, no storm. The land lay barren, a plain of shattered stone, where even the ash refused to stir. The regiment marched into it, expecting ambush, their lasguns primed, their hearts heavy from all they had endured. But as they crossed the threshold, sound itself deserted them. Vox units crackled once, then fell mute. Engines that had sputtered for weeks groaned and died. Their machine spirits snuffed as though choked. Even the storm winds that had scoured every other world in the sector grew still, as if the sky had taken a final breath and refused to release it. The silence was absolute. It was not the hush of discipline, nor the muffled quiet of fear. It was the weight of something larger, a silence that swallowed intention itself. Soldiers tried to speak, mouths opening, but no words emerged. They could feel sound leave their throats, yet no echo returned. Even the clash of boot on stone became invisible, their footsteps nothing more than the memory of motion. Only one sound remained, inescapable, the beating of their hearts. It thundered inside their skulls, slow and ponderous, a drumbeat that carried louder than any cannon fire. Men staggered beneath it, hands pressed to their chests, as though the sound would burst through. Some fell to their knees in reverence. The chaplains raised trembling hands and declared this was the Emperor's silence, his presence pressing against them, stripping away every distraction, every noise of war. They wept, convinced that here, in stillness, they had come closest to him. Others looked upon the plain with terror, lips quivering as they mouthed words no ear could hear. They believed the silence was not sanctity, but hunger, that the sector itself had grown full and now consumed not flesh, not faith, but the very echo of existence. In silence, they whispered, "Nothing can resist." Hours passed. Some men tore at their ears, desperate to hear anything beyond the drumbeat of their hearts. Others clung to the stillness as though to a lifeline, faces slack in strange peace. The sleepless captain stood at the center of the plain, his hollow eyes gleaming. For the first time, he seemed calm, his body slack, his gaze neither fractured nor fevered. He lifted one hand, and without words, the regiment stilled. He turned his face upward, and the silence deepened, as though the plain leaned closer to listen. His lips moved. No one heard what he said, but every man swore. The beating of his own heart faltered for an instant, as if pausing to catch the words, and then the captain was gone. No collapse, no scream, no wound. One heartbeat he stood among them, the next he was absence given shape. His men reached for him, hands clawing at the space where he had been, but they touched only still air. Some fell weeping, others bowed their heads, all convinced that the silence had claimed him. The regiment lingered in that impossible quiet, until time itself seemed fractured. Days or hours, none could tell. They marched eventually, not by command, not by order, but by instinct, leaving the heart of the sector behind. When they crossed its edge, sound returned all at once. Engines roared, Vox units screamed with static, boots thundered on stone, and men clutched their ears as the weight of the world came crashing back. Yet something in them had changed. None spoke of it openly, but every man carried the memory of silence. Every man heard his own heartbeat differently thereafter. Years later, survivors still argued over what the silence meant. Some swore it was the Emperor's hand, proof that he shielded even the lost. Others whispered that it was the sector feeding, taking its final tithe from their captain and leaving them with echoes of their own mortality. Both sides carried their truth with equal fervor, but in one thing they agreed: the campaign did not end with victory, nor with defeat. It ended with quiet, And so the records close. No banners raised, no songs of triumph, no monuments carved. Only silence remains in the archives, where the campaign's logs should have been. Silence in the Vox records, silence in the data slates, silence in the stones of the cities where they marched. The sector itself drifts nameless still, forgotten not by accident, but by will. For to speak of it is to hear again that silence, to feel the weight of one's own heartbeat, measured against eternity. In the end, perhaps silence was the only victory possible. Not the roar of war, not the hymns of faith, not the laughter of orcs, or the sermons of smoke. Only the quiet, heavy, and unbroken, where even memory dared not intrude. And in that stillness whether gift or curse lay the last. Truth of the warp-touched sector. Some endings are not written in blood, nor in flame, but in the sound of nothing at all.